The subcommittee will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess at any time without objection, so ordered. Good afternoon. This subcommittee covers sea power and projection forces. Today we'll hear about the projection part of this portfolio. Our witnesses this afternoon have been in front of this committee a few times, and I'd like to thank you for meeting with me last week via phone. Thank you for your service, and welcome to the subcommittee. Projection forces plays an important role in the military's ability to be anywhere at any time. Airlift, bombers, and tankers are critical. Mr. Alford and I had a great visit to Palmdale, California last week and are very impressed with the progress of the B-21. As you know, the challenge from China is growing, and the Air Force must have the right aircraft, systems, and capabilities to carry out any mission anywhere, and I think the B-21 will perform admirably. I'd like to hear from our witnesses discussing the urgency we have to have enough air refueling capacity and capability for a possible China fight across a very large Indo-PACOM AOR. Finally, I'd like to hear from our witnesses today on how our projection forces are being modernized to meet the future threats. Before we introduce the witnesses, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Courtney, our ranking member, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Kelly, and thank you to both witnesses for joining us here today. And I'm going to be very brief and ask that my written remarks be entered into the record. Again, I just want to agree with the chairman that the projection forces mission of our subcommittee is one that we take very seriously. We've got great staff that do such a good job in terms of analyzing the president's budget when it comes over, and we are not a rubber stamp. I mean, historically, if you look at some of the changes and I think improvements that the subcommittee has made, whether it's the tanker program, Air Force One, or the C-130s, it's really made a positive difference for the Air Force and for Air Force projection and airlift. And again, so I look forward to the witnesses' testimony. Again, Mr. Chairman, if doesn't have any objection, just ask my written remarks be entered.
Without objection.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. He's always correcting me. He was a chairman longer than I've been, so he's gently reminding me to do certain things. So I always appreciate my ranking member and his partnership in this. Much like you guys are partners, you can't do this without a strong team. Our briefers today are Mr. Andrew Hunter, who is the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisition, and Lieutenant General Rick Moore is the Deputy Chief of Staff for the Plans and Programs. I understand, Mr. Hunter, that you're going to give an opening statement, so the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to you and Ranking Member Courtney and all the members of the subcommittee for the support that you provided to the Department of the Air Force over a number of years. And we absolutely greatly appreciate the fact that you've taken the time to visit our installations, visit our facilities, visit our airmen and guardians, and to understand how we perform the mission, how they perform the mission, and how the programs that you oversee are supporting that mission. So that's really vital, and we greatly appreciate it. And I'm very happy to be here today with my colleague, Lieutenant General Moore, to provide testimony on the Air Force's fiscal year 2024 budget request for projection forces aviation programs. The Department of the Air Force's fiscal year 24 President's budget request reflects our commitment to developing a threat-informed future Air Force equipped to win a high-end fight. Last year, Secretary Kendall and General Brown outlined the 7 operational imperatives we must meet to succeed in this mission. The operational imperatives were the combined work of the entire Air and Space Force teams, combining the best insights of operators, analysts, and the acquisition enterprise. As a result of this analysis and work, we have over $25 billion requested in the fiscal year 24 budget for OI-related investments, a significant portion of which is new funds applied to programs that are new compared to our previous President's budget request. Our fiscal year 24 request balances this investment in critically needed new capability with recapitalization and modernization of our existing platforms. In my oral remarks, I'm going to highlight just a few of these key investments, and the written statement that the General and I submitted goes through them in some detail. I want to start with the B-21. The B-21 Raider will form the backbone of our future bomber force, and it is a centerpiece of the Secretary of the Air Force's 6th operational imperative. The B-21 underscores our national security as the most flexible leg of the nuclear triad and supports combatant commanders across a range of military objectives as both a nuclear and conventional bomber. The fiscal year 24 President's budget request fully funds engineering and manufacturing development and initial production for the B-21. Additionally, the fiscal year 24 President's budget request includes modernization activities focused on nuclear certification, integration of the long-range standoff weapon, and other modernization activities. There are today B-21 test aircraft in flow on the manufacturing line. They are being built using the same tooling, processes, and technicians who will build the production aircraft, and that's a substantial goes a substantial way to improving the maturity of that platform and its readiness for production. The B-21 had a successful rollout last December and is working towards first flight. Support for the fiscal year 24 budget request for the B-21 is critical to recapitalizing our bomber force and being prepared to deter future conflicts. The other element of our long-term plan for the bomber force is the B-52. While the last B-52 Stratofortress entered service in the Air Force in 1962, we expect to continue operating the B-52 beyond 2050. To get there, we have work to do. The Air Force's #1 priority for the B-52 is to ensure the platform viability through 2050 with the Commercial Engine Replacement Program that enables us to achieve this goal. It's important to note that SERP is more complex than just replacing today's engine with a commercial engine from commercial use. The SERP program includes the new engines, but also flight systems, cockpit throttles, and displays as a combined system to provide power and propulsion to the jet. In September 2023, the SERP program will seek a Milestone B decision, which will authorize the program to enter into engineering and manufacturing development, transitioning from the middle tier of acquisition rapid prototyping effort that we have had to date. It'll formally initiate the program and set the acquisition program baseline. Let me talk about our mobility fleet. Due to an updated threat environment, we have modified our tanker recapitalization approach from what we have discussed in prior years, setting aside the three-phase approach originally envisioned in the early 2000s in favor of prioritizing and accelerating the right capabilities to deliver fuel to the joint force and to the fight. The next generation air refueling system will be an accelerated, advanced air refueling system that meets the future needs of the joint force in the contested battle space. We will actively consider clean sheet, purpose-built designs for NGAS, with aircraft delivered in increments as part of a family of systems that allows the Department of the Air Force to remain flexible and responsive to the evolving and ever-changing threat. The program is being designed to leverage continuous competition and will be competitive from the first day. We've begun work on the NGAS analysis of alternatives that will be completed in fiscal year 24 and is going to inform NGAS requirements and development timelines in cooperation with industry and the information that they provide. Initial deliveries are expected to begin in the mid to late 2030s. Our work with the operational imperatives has been extensive, and you see the outcome of that in our fiscal year 24 budget request. But in significant ways, the work for operational imperatives has really just begun. As we begin to implement the recommendations born out of our initial work, we're continuing to examine areas such as cross-cutting operational enablers that are critical to success, and this includes mobility. This work will leverage and complement our work on NGAS and the Next Generation Air Mobility Study to identify priorities to enable our future operations. Lastly, let me speak to the importance of delivering this budget on time. More than ever, it is critical that the Department avoid the delays driven by extended continuing resolutions. The OIs include multiple New START programs that must begin as soon as possible. We cannot cede any more time during a critical moment in the Air Force's transition to being prepared for the future fight. I also want to close by asking for your support for a legislative proposal recently transmitted by OMB to Congress, creating a new authority for the military services to respond to emergent technology advances and threats. This authority will accelerate our ability to respond to a rapidly changing security environment with effective congressional oversight. We look forward to working with this subcommittee, and I thank you again for your continued support, and General Moore and I stand ready to address your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hunter. It's been a bit troubling to watch the KC-46's problems with the remote vision system, and now we're hearing there's another delay to field the program. Can you explain why there have been so many delays and how it benefits the taxpayers to even think about purchasing more?
So with the remote vision system, one thing that's important to note is this is a deficiency to the specification the Air Force provided to Boeing. Therefore, they are correcting that deficiency at their expense. So they are paying the bill to develop the fix for the RVS 2.0, and they will pay to install and retrofit the previously purchased aircraft and to cut in the fix into the new production aircraft. So on the cost side of the RVS 2.0, the taxpayer is protected there. As to the timing of its delivery, we did run into issues with the supply chain there and getting the necessary equipment, both in terms of displays, but also some of the boxes that end up transmitting and processing the signal there that have pushed back the program schedule. So we are now looking to fielding that system in calendar year 25, but fiscal year 26 to begin fielding of it. And that is later than we would prefer. Having said that, Air Mobility Command has set the parameters under which the platform is able to operate today, and they are successfully refueling aircraft with the system that they're currently using.
Okay, because I just think, you know, the sense of urgency we need to be capable of fighting tonight. And so I'm glad that we're not talking about divesting and, you know, future and all that stuff. But thank you very much. Mr. Hunter, I was in Palmdale last week, and we're happy with what we saw. And knock on wood, the program seems to be on track. Can you confirm to us that the Air Force will maintain continuous oversight of the program and not go down the path of the B-2 when the program was truncated?
I can absolutely assure you that we are paying very close attention to this program, and that is true at my level. That is true with my close partner, the commander of Global Strike Command, who is the major command that provides the resources and establishes the requirements for the B-21 program. We are tightly synced. We meet regularly to discuss the program and everything that is happening on it. So we are in close touch. And sort of the management philosophy for the B-21 program is something we call active management. So it's continuous engagement between the government, the program office, the program manager, and the contractor, Northrop Grumman in this case, to identify any unexpected eventualities or risks that are emerging on the program. And because of the way the program has been managed by the Air Force, set up by my predecessors, we have the resources in place usually when a risk does arise or when something does get off track to apply resources and to identify a fix and make a fix relatively quickly. And that active management approach has really served the program well.
And Mr. Hunter, and if there's a CR, which programs in this portfolio that we own will suffer the most?
So it depends a little bit at what level the funding is established at under the CR. Sometimes CRs go at a prior year funding, sometimes they're at less. I don't know that I've seen one that was more. And so the funding level is important. The programs that are most effective are those that are new starts in fiscal year 24 because they simply can't begin under our standard operating procedures, usually specified in the continuing resolution. The legislative proposal I mentioned, I think, would give us some ability on critical priorities to do some early work, even under a continuing resolution approach. And that's one reason why we're so eager to work with you on potentially providing that authority. The second is programs that have a significant change in funding or that are transitioning from one stage to another. So a program moving from development into production, and where the initial production funds would come in the 24 budget, they would not have access to production money during the span of a continuing resolution. So, you know, there are programs that are making this transition in fiscal year 24. They could be greatly impacted by an extended CR.
Thank you. And General Moore, final question. The KC-135 is considered the backbone of the air refueling fleet and will be in service for many decades to come. How will the Air Force support the modernization throughout the rest of the life cycle of the KC-135s?
Yes, sir. The 135 will be in service for something like another 2.5 or 3 decades, and we are mindful of what it takes to get an airplane that far out. So, two separate things. First of all, airframe and airworthiness modifications and enhancements. The System Program Office in Oklahoma City runs a program called Coral Reach that looks at how to keep the airframe itself viable. And over the years, as the airplanes have aged, it's done a great job of making sure that we don't have any airworthiness problems. That will continue for the life of the airframe. And then certainly the avionics become a part of this as well. And some of the avionics right now, particularly the fuel system panel and some of the other items in the navigation display area, they are beginning to show their age, and in fact, they're reaching the end of their life. And so you'll see in this budget a request to replace the avionics in the center pedestal to make sure that the aircraft is viable into the future.
Thank you. And with that, I now yield to Mr. Courtney, the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just to follow up again on Chairman Kelly's question regarding the KC-46. Again, in prior years, we've had these hearings where General Moore's predecessor, General Nahum, would come in, and we were sort of getting updates in terms of the percentage of interim operability, which the last time we met, I think it was in the 50 to 70% range or whatever. But my understanding is it has continued to improve, and I'm just wondering, just for the purposes of an update, where does that stand?
Yeah, I think we can get you an exact figure for the record, but in terms of the ability to refuel, right now the only Air Force platform in operations that is not refuelable by the KC-46 is essentially the A-10. And we do have the capacity with the rest of our fleet to be able to service that, the air refueling needs of that platform. So we are able to meet the overwhelming number of air refueling missions required using the KC-46 as it's operating today.
Right.
And if your question though was on mission capability rates,
Right,
I can
yes.
get you that answer for the record.
Okay.
Sir. Yeah.
Yes, sir. I'll add that at the beginning of the Ukraine crisis about a year ago, we deployed 4 airplanes to Morón, Spain. They performed very, very well in a deployed environment, and one of the things that we worked on while they were there was certification with European refueling platforms. Lots of progress there as well. So there are some things about the KC-46 that need to be made right. As Mr. Hunter mentioned, Boeing is on contract to do that, and we will hold them to that. But the airplane is performing very, very well, and it's performing well in an operational environment, and it is on the road every single day now.
Great, thank you. And I just would sort of reiterate your comment that this is not on the taxpayer's dime. Again, Mr. Whitman and I had many painful hearings, and made sure that that was actually not going to be the outcome here. So, and I think the Air Force has kind of held its ground as well on that. So, in your testimony, going to another program that we've had multiple hearings in the past on Air Force One, there's a request for $490 million to continue engineering and manufacturing development. Again, initially, those planes should have been up in the air flying by right now, and obviously they're not. And I wonder if you could give us an update in terms of, particularly that vendor problem with the interior of the plane, as well as just an explanation of what the $490 million is for.
Yes, sir. Rick may want to speak specifically to the exact usage of the dollars, but in terms of the status of the program, the interior subcontractor that Boeing had originally hired as part of their proposal for the program was not performing in terms of the work that they were tasked to do, and also I think they had real significant financial issues that even if they had been capable of doing the work would have potentially been a barrier to them being successful. So Boeing made the decision to terminate that subcontractor and bring another subcontractor aboard to do that work. When you hear the term interiors, it sounds like seat cushions and like sort of trimmings and surface level stuff. But in fact, what you're talking about is the non-747 commercial aircraft parts of the aircraft, anything sort of inside the fuselage. So it's actually a tremendous scope of work. It requires significant engineering expertise to carry out the work that subcontractor is expected to perform. So there was a delay. There was a lot of work had to be redone during the transition from one supplier to another. But they are now up on step. They have progressed well beyond where the previous subcontractor had gotten with the design. Particularly would highlight the work put in on the engineering for the wiring. There's quite a bit, miles and miles of wire on this aircraft, as you would expect for an aircraft of this size and complexity. And a lot of engineering being done to get that engineering work done right, and making sure that we won't have to do rework, as has happened on other similar aircraft where we've had to do some of this engineering work on the front end. So I think they have really gotten back into the right place programmatically. It is delayed, as I know you're aware, but they are now performing to our expectations at this stage of the effort.
And the budget request?
Sir, both airplanes are undergoing modification right now. There is, as Mr. Hunter mentioned, a lot of work going on the interiors, as well as installation of wiring and modification in the places where the airframe itself needs to be modified. For example, the height of the lower lobe door. Some of those modifications are in progress as well. So it's what it takes to produce an aircraft of presidential quality times two, and they both are undergoing modification as we speak.
Well, thank you. Again, it's something that we have been tracking and will continue to track. My last question is just simply on, again, we've historically done plus-ups to have propeller replacements for the C-130s. And maybe you could just, and we talked about this a little bit before the hearing in terms of just sort of where that all stands, because it's really a safety issue, and where we are with schedule.
Yeah, and as we discussed, sir, the availability of that propeller production line was very valuable to us this year, because we had the issue with the center barrel on the older model of the propeller. We had some cracking there. We had to take a number of those items out of service, and having an operating production capacity for the new propeller design, where all the engineering work had already been done and you were into production, has really been invaluable at helping us recover the fleet back to operational capability. And in fact, we worked with the contractor to increase that production rate so that we could get to a get well date for the C-130 fleet well ahead of our original projections. We're now projecting that we will be fully get well in this year, and we were able to accelerate that by about 10 months from the original plan through working with the propeller contractor, and also working with a lot of our partners and allies who operate these aircraft to find some additional supplies.
10 months ahead of schedule. I want to end that positive note.
All right, I now recognize General Bergman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks you all for being here. Quick question, just out of curiosity. What I heard you say was the only aircraft that our new tanker can't refuel is the A-10. Got that right?
Yes.
So what can refuel an A-10?
So we still have a large fleet of KC-135s. Even at the completion of the KC-46 program, we'll still have nearly 300 KC-135s, and they can all refuel A-10s.
Okay, so we still have the capability.
Yes, sir.
All right. We were talking before we sat down here about the longest running production lines in aviation history in those aircraft. The current long-term bomber force structure, you got 145 B-21s, 75 B-52s. The new upgrades to the B-52 is going to extend its service life out to the 2050s. Does the Air Force truly believe that a 100-year-old airplane will compete in a contested environment against China in 2050?
So the aircraft that will go into the contested environment, specifically in a Chinese fight against Chinese aggression into the highly contested environment, will be the B-21. The B-52 has a much higher volume of weapons delivery, as you're well familiar, but it will be from standoff range. The B-52 is not envisioned to go into the highly contested environment. It will deliver large payloads from range.
So as we look at, prosecuting the fight in 2030 as opposed to prosecuting the fight in 2050, I mean, that's asking you to, put your Jedi mindset on and look way out there. Is the Air Force considering for lack of a better term, a clean sheet, purpose-built design to replace the B-52 that would address those future, necessary capabilities that we would have, or do you think that will the B-21 take care of it all, or are we going to add another? And by the way, it is what it is. We need the capabilities necessary to prosecute a fight, whether it's today, 2030, or 2050. But just the long-term, skunk works kind of thinking.
Yes, sir, absolutely agree. So I think that could certainly be a possibility. I don't think we've reached that decision point yet. I think the things that we're working on in the near term are NGAD and NGAS, with NGAL to follow directly on. In the meantime, I think the decision point that we'll come to sooner is what the actual production run of the B-21 will be, and that will depend on its performance, and we'll know that here in the next couple of years, as well as how the threat changes. As you've seen with the next-gen air refueling system, we have pulled that 15 years or so to the left because of the change in threat. Certainly the same thing could happen in the bomber portfolio. If we find out there's an emerging threat that the B-21 is not capable of handling, we would look to replace or add to the bomber fleet with something that could handle that threat. We're not to that decision point yet. For right now, everything that we see can be managed by the B-21, and the near-term decision point on that will be what will the production run be? And I think probably a place where we would look to make a change in this portfolio, if we were going to, would be weapons and not necessarily the airframes. What we see from the Chinese is rapid spiraling of weapons capability, and I think that might be a more likely place where we would attempt to counter the threat rather than a clean sheet design. But I certainly wouldn't rule that out, and it may be that we don't have a choice.
Okay. Well, to switch subjects, switch gears here. We're not going to talk about airframes here. We're going to talk about people for a second. Roughly 250 Boeing workers with expired security credentials worked aboard the new Air Force One on a highly classified system, so I've been told. What has the Air Force done to ensure that this was a one-time event and cannot be repeated? I mean, things happen, but how are we going to prevent it from happening again?
Yeah, so we have worked closely with Boeing to correct the errors on their system. My understanding is they actually replaced the corporate official who was responsible corporately overall for the procedures that they were supposed to be following there and failed to follow. So there has been accountability in that case, and we're working closely with Boeing to make sure that the individuals who needed to have their clearance processes updated are in that process. And we have identified who those folks are, understand, and for the most part, these were people who actually had valid clearances, but the specific clearance that they needed to have, the paperwork had not been submitted.
Do we know of any other programs potentially that we found the same scenario with contractors, or was this an isolated incident?
There are a very limited number of programs that participate in this particular security process. My understanding is that it is we are up to speed on the very limited number of other programs, essentially one, that participates.
Okay. And, I guess as we've seen recently in the news, compromising of sensitive classified information into a public domain, I believe there's it's not only an opportunity, but it's essential that Air Force and every other, military service make sure that those folks who have access to anything classified are vetted, and if they do something bad, they are appropriately disciplined. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. Now recognize Mr. Norcross.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd just like to remember my colleagues, just because it's old doesn't make it bad. There's some nice things that are a little bit more aged that work real well, and we happen to be part of that. that going on, Mr. Hunter, love to discuss NGAS. In this committee over the last few years, we've had a lot of discussions with the Pegasus program, the RVS, and we all know how frustrating it is, and our colleagues have mentioned it. It is on Boeing's dime, but the time is on us, the U.S. But the one thing I do want to point out is when this KC-46 was first to be delivered, if that system on the RVS had been approved, we would have a system that's over 10 years old now. We have the newest, and by any accounts, the best system in the world. Would you agree with that statement?
Sir, that is accurate. So the system that is being designed as for 2.0, the technology for that did not exist when the original design for KC-46 was made.
Yeah, certainly not the way we want to go about it, but there is the good side of what is going on here. But I'm going to talk a little bit more. Originally, you had mentioned the three-phase approach we were going to take for tankers, including a bridge program, which is now put to the side because we want to go to the NGAS, a stealth refueling capacity. Stealth is relative to what we're talking about. Where can it be seen? How far in? Can you, to the point we can in open session, give us the scenarios that you would see this new tanker envision, where it would be able to operate under a contested environment?
Yeah, and let me preface my comments by saying the exact mix, the exact potential ways in which we would employ the platform, these are things that the analysis of alternatives will be looking at. So there is analysis to be done here, operational analysis about, what is the most beneficial way to carry this out. But the key issue is not that hard to understand. So we have air refueling capability in order to air refuel the aircraft that are engaging in missions. So our combat aircraft that are engaged in the high-end fight will have to be refueled by a system that they can reach and that can get close enough to them to be operationally relevant and to enable the operations they have to carry out. So it's that distance, right? It's that distance that it takes the tactical aircraft to have to go back and forth from the tanker while being able to perform its mission that's governing how close the tanker fleet has to get to a potential fight. And the threats that we see in that in that area are what is driving us to need the technologies and the NGAS will deliver.
So as we understand, the KC-46 Pegasus has a hardened frame and also would be usable as a communication device as many other things. Would you envision NGAS being part of that communications network?
I think it's very much the case that we think situational awareness and effective comms will be critical to NGAS, to the requirements that we'll have for the NGAS system. And we have some of those things on the KC-46 today.
Thank you. No other questions. I yield back.
I now recognize former chairman of this subcommittee, Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Assistant Secretary Hunter, Lieutenant General Moore, thank you so much for joining us. Assistant Secretary Hunter, I wanted to start with you. The 2020 report that the Air Force gave to Congress talked about the deficit in the availability of tanker hours at about 6,000. We know that the floor for the number of aircraft, the minimum number of tankers in the fleet, is at 466. We know that we are 467 today, so precipitously close to where the floor is. The President's budget continues to capitalize the KC-46As with 179 aircraft. You had spoken, though, previously to say that you envision over the lifetime of the near-term acquisition, of cutting that acquisition in half, essentially from 150 aircraft down to 75 aircraft, to, for the most part, be able to resource NGAS into the 2030s. With that in mind, does the Air Force currently have the capacity for surge tanking? So if the balloon were to go up tonight and we needed surge tanking to be able to prosecute operations in the Indo-PACOM, do we have the surge capacity with the current tanker fleet across all the different years of variations of aircraft? And where do you see that capacity 5 years or 10 years from now, which is going to intersect with where the pathway is for new KC-46A coming into the fleet? And does the decision that you put in place to essentially curb the KC-46Y competition, does that affect that? And you heard Mr. Norcross ask a little bit about NGAS and the other capabilities going in the future without modernizing that aircraft to have some sort of self-protect provisions there. I think that's certainly a situation that we want to know about. And then, as I spoke about earlier, your report from 2020 points out the 6,000-hour gap per year of tanker hours in availability. Tell us where that leaves the Air Force with any future considerations. And are you considering augmenting this with commercial tanker availabilities within that realm?
Let me work through as many of those questions as I
Yes,
can in
yes.
the time allotted,
Yeah.
sir. I think the big picture that is important to focus on first is we are going to be maintaining the tanker levels that we have projected forward across the FIDEP. That is our plan. It is why we have taken the approach that we have of going back to industry with a revised requirement, so not the KCY requirement, which was beyond what today's tanker fleet is capable of doing, and which we learned in conversation with industry was likely to lead to a gap, a time post KC-46-179, but prior to anything else coming on board, there was likely to be a gap there based on what we were seeing in our responses from industry. That is part of why we revised our plan, to simplify that requirement, have it be very similar to today's tanker requirement, so that we can maximize our ability to have continuous tanker production throughout the FIDEP and throughout the 2020s and into the 2030s until we can get to NGAS. So that's a core part of our plan, is to sustain the force and ensure we continue to have that capability. I've talked quite a bit. I mentioned that when it comes to B-21, we work very closely with Global Strike Command. In this case, we work very closely with Air Mobility Command to understand what the operating the fleet looks like from their perspective and how our acquisition programs support their ability to do that. My understanding from General Minahan is he has high confidence in the ability of today's fleet to carry out the missions that they're assigned and that they would need to engage in a fight. It's not a simple matter, and as we know, he's very focused on this, works this problem every day. So on the issue of competition, we will have to go back to industry. We are going back to industry with a revised requirement based on our KC-135 recapitalization plan and based on the number of aircraft that we would see being procured through that effort until we got to NGAS to find out what industry can deliver to us, when they can deliver it. And then we will evaluate that and make a decision on the acquisition strategy for KC-135 recapitalization.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Dr. Jackson. I now recognize Mr. Alford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the witnesses being here today. Thank you, Ranking Member Courtney. I'm honored to represent the home of the B-2 stealth bomber in Whiteman Air Force Base in the great state of Missouri, and I recently, along with Chairman Kelly, visited Palmdale, and that B-21 is impressive, as you know, and I'm just so glad that we got to see it and touch it and see what this great thing is going to do for our nation. It's a critical piece, as you know, of our effort to deter China and modernize our smaller and aging bomber fleet and force. This program has stayed on target and within budget, and we are committed to working with our colleagues on this committee and both of you to make sure it stays that way. And that I am also fighting to make sure that it does end up in Missouri. Considering China's rapid military buildup, we cannot afford delays to programs like the B-21. We need the B-21, as you know, to counter the threat from China and bolster our bomber force. So, Lieutenant General Moore, considering the status of the B-2 and the transition of the B-21, can you talk a little bit about the modernization efforts made to the B-2? Are we making the necessary investments, such as ACS, to keep the B-2 program lethal and capable until B-21? Basically, are we ready today to have a conflict with China?
Sir, we are doing that with the B-2. The most notable example I could give is the replacement of all the displays in the cockpit because they're reaching the end of their life, and we are proceeding with that program. I am pleased to tell you as well that the Secretary's announced the preferred alternative for the second location for B-21, and it's Whiteman. The environmental study is going on now and should be complete by sometime next summer. So we look forward to operationalizing the B-21 at Whiteman. And we also, as a key milestone in that, the nuclear certification of the B-21 is also on track, and that is the major milestone that we have to hit before we start to retire the B-2s. So I think all of this looks like we have a solid approach to this that'll play out over the end of the rest of the 20s.
Just two other, if I could, modernization programs to highlight there with the B-2 is continuing weapons integration, including the extended range variant of the JASM. And there's some comm upgrade programs that have been going on the B-2 for some time that we are continuing to finish to make sure that it's integrated, especially as terms of NC3.
I'd like to hear more about that in another setting, please. Lieutenant General Moore, I want to follow up a little bit about the safety stand-down of the B-2. Are you familiar with the statement that General Bussier released on what's going on?
I may not be familiar with that statement, but I am familiar with the issue.
Of course, we all know that there was an incident on the 10th of December, an in-flight malfunction. General Bussier has said that the Safety Investigation Board for this incident is currently set for the 28th of April, 10 days from now. And of course, the outcomes will determine the necessary corrective actions. When we were out in Palmdale, I asked the same question. I want to ask it to you just to make sure that we have this on record for the public. The problems that we have seen in the B-2, those are being corrected and not going to be present in the B-21, correct?
So I can't speak to the engineering level. What I can tell you is the B-21 is not an updated version of a B-2. It is a newly designed airplane. And I will also tell you, although the B-2 fleet has stood down, it is able to fly with General Bussier's approval, and he is comfortable putting it in the air in the event that a mission need would arise.
He did make that quite clear, and I would let you follow up, sir.
Yeah, so in the engineering level, obviously we'll need to have the final processes out of the safety process. But my judgment is that we are narrowing in on an engineering fix to the issues that led us to where we are today, and we will be able to carry out that fix in the near term. I do not anticipate that we would see the same kind of issue on the B-21.
Got 40 seconds left, and I want to follow up with you, Mr. Hunter. The Air Force has repeatedly called for divestment of legacy aircraft to modernize the force for the China fight. Can you explain which capabilities the divestment will be used for, sir?
So they are the ones that we have proposed in the budget. A-10 is a big one of that. The other one that I highlight quite a bit, although I know it's in another subcommittee, but is the transition from E3 to E7. And one of the primary enablers of us bringing E7 on board as quickly as possible is being able to take crews from the E3 fleet, train them with our Australian partners who are flying E7 today, and when we get that aircraft on the ramp, we will be able to get it into operations as soon as possible. So those are the kinds of things that we're referring to. In terms of the aircraft we're talking about today, there are no near-term retirements in this fleet, but in future years as we get towards fielding of B-21, that would become more relevant in that area.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, General. I yield back.
Gentlemen's time has expired. Now recognize Ms. Kiggins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses here today. And I represent Hampton Roads area, so I've got the Navy master jet base, so it's always interesting to get some insight into how our other partners in the sky are doing business. But a couple questions. How long does it take to train an Air Force F-35 pilot from commissioning till the time they touch a gray aircraft?
So typically we have a year of pilot training, another 3 to 4 months of introduction to fighter fundamentals, and then another 4 or 5 months of F-35 training before they're able to go to an operational unit.
So, and are these kids getting commissioned and going right to flight school, or what is that wait time like before they start?
In some cases, there is a wait before they go to pilot training. Right now, that wait is almost a year. It's actually fairly long, and on occasion, there is actually, normally, there is a wait in between each of those phases.
So in total, what is the total length of time?
I'd have to take that question for the record, and we can come back and tell you what it averages.
For example, the Navy takes about 4 years roughly by the time these kids are commissioned until the time they actually touch a gray aircraft, which is too long in my opinion. So I know there's not a lot of appetite for, I think we tried some combination training with the Navy. At least on the Navy side, there didn't seem to be much appetite for going back to joint training. But I just want to know, I've heard from the Navy side, what is the Air Force side about challenges to pilot training? What can we do to improve this? I know that, we're competing with retention for our more senior pilots. We're always competing with the airline industry. I mean, it costs $10 million approximately to train, a fighter pilot these days. I'm worried that we're going to need these fighter pilots quickly, a lot quicker than 4 years. So what can we do to expedite that process and eliminate some of these wait times? It's not just the Air Force specific, but I want to hear from you guys.
Yes, ma'am. Fair question. So we have redesigned pilot training over the last couple of years to bring it forward from the kind of 1950s and 60s industrial era pilot training program. We were calling it undergraduate pilot training UPT 2.5. We've stopped calling it that now because it's finished. It is just pilot training, and it's the way we train all of our pilots now. There's a lot more integration of augmented reality training. We have allowed them to graduate on their own pace. They don't have to wait for an entire class until they can graduate. We've done everything we can to maximize their ability to perform and advance and make it through pilot training. We also are looking at the capacity of the flying training units, which is where they go next. And to minimize one of those gaps between pilot training and introduction to fighter fundamentals, we've actually combined those so that they're part of a single syllabus. So there's no gap in between. They start at the beginning, and when they finish, they've done both parts of that. No break in training, no gap, no retraining, no recurrency, none of that. So we are working through this as best we can, and we share your concern that folks are not flying quickly enough and they're not flying enough. That certainly is on the forefront of the Secretary and the Chief's mind as well.
Yeah, I do hear from the chief regularly on the topic of pilot production. We don't do that in AQ, but the platforms that enable the production pipeline are obviously platforms that we either sustain or are working to acquire in the case of the T7. So it's always on the chief's radar screen, and General Robinson, who heads Air Education Training Command, we work closely with his team. There are some issues with the legacy platform of the T-38 in terms of its availability, and that's been a limiter on their ability to accelerate and increase the flow through the pilot production pipeline. And then with some of the delays on delivery of the T7, that is also something that we're going to have to work through and extend the T-38 to go even longer to make that transition. So we focus on that on a weekly basis on both ends of that to try and enable more pilot production to the extent that we can.
Good, thank you. Thanks for keeping that a priority. And can you just talk to me briefly, I've got about 1 more minute left, just about how you're integrating unmanned aircraft into your squadrons and what that looks like going forward?
Well, so one of our really premier initiatives in the 24 budget is to really accelerate the CCA program, the Collaborative Combat Aircraft Program, which is designed from the get-go to be fully integrated and a partner to crewed fighter aircraft and other crewed aircraft in operations. We have established or have funding in the 24 budget to do a operational experimentation unit to really test out how is this going to work, what are the CONOPS for this kind of coordination, this kind of collaboration between a manned platform and a manned unit and an uncrewed platform, uncrewed squadron.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Hunter and General Moore, thank you so much for your time and your testimony today. I represent Barksdale Air Force Base and Global Strike, and so I'm keenly interested in the topics we're talking about today. I would just say real quickly on the important issue of pilot training, just a week ago I was on base and they let me try out the new cutting-edge virtual reality simulator for the B-52. I crashed the plane immediately. I'm terrible. But they had these young pilots there that are aces on this virtual reality, and it is so similar. And obviously the cost savings and the time efficiency is remarkable what they're doing. I commend everybody for their work on that. I'm obviously very interested in the health and readiness of our bomber force, given who I represent. And in that vein, you mentioned in your written statement the number one priority for the B-52 is to ensure that it remains viable through 2050. It'll be a 100-year aircraft. It's an engineering marvel. And you've talked about how SERP is integral to achieving that goal. So we know that the TF-33 engine is not going to be supportable for much longer, and I hear from my folks all the time about problems with parts availability and how the current engines are constantly having to be take off the plane for maintenance and then put back on and on and on. Can one or both of you talk us through some of the issues you're experiencing with that engine and describe how SERP will alleviate these problems?
Well, SERP fully replaces the TF-33. And, when you consider any individual engine and how often when they break as frequently as the TF-33s do, and of course the B-52 has 8 of them, so that's 8 opportunities to have something that interrupts an operation or causes you not be able to take off. So it's a huge impact on the operation of the platform. The SERP program will replace all of the TF-33s with the F-130, so a commercial derivative but brand new engine with with the supply chain that is consistent with what's out there today in the commercial sector. So I think it will really address and solve the issues that we're seeing today with the TF-33. And the critical thing for us is how quickly we can do the engineering work and procure the kits in order to get those installations begun and then completed across the B-52 fleet.
I really appreciate how you said in your testimony it's more than just slapping new engines on an old airplane. It's really kind of a game changer redesign in so many ways. And I don't know, some of my colleagues may not realize it, but you step into the cockpit of a B-52, it's like stepping back into the 1960s. I mean, it's just antiquated. It's hard for me to believe that we're still using some of this equipment. And I mean, the dash is analog dials. It's got tons of info being thrown at the pilots and co-pilots from all over the place. Can you talk to us about what these upgrades are, the things associated with SERP, and how that's going to improve the crew's situational awareness and their ability to successfully conduct their mission?
Yeah, and we do have, in addition to the SERP program, there is the radar modernization, which will dramatically improve the organic sensing that the platform has and can convey to the pilot for situational awareness and for being able to strike targets, being able to ensure the accuracy that we expect and delivers the effectiveness that we need for the strike capabilities of the platform. And the comms upgrades, so having more pipes for more data to then be able to provide situational awareness from off-board the aircraft to improve the pilot's ability to engage in collaboration with the rest of the Air Force to strike the targets they need to strike. So it's all 3 programs working together, and when you look at it, this is a almost complete overhaul of the mission capabilities, mission systems of the B-52, and that is what will enable it to operate well into the future.
And not a moment too soon. I understand that testing is underway at Stennis for the new F-130 engine, and that the Air Force is going to seek a Milestone B decision a little bit later this year, I think. Can you elaborate on how the testing process is going, and what are some of the things you're hoping to accomplish before that Milestone B decision is made?
Yes, sir. We are transitioning the program, so it was a middle tier of acquisition rapid prototyping. The rapid prototyping effort is delivering a digital prototype and has done quite a bit of risk reduction on the program. When we get to Milestone B, it will become what we would call a formal acquisition program of record, major capability acquisition program. That allows us to do the full 30-year plus life cycle sustainment planning that we would do for a platform that we're going to operate and sustain over decades period of time. In terms of the risk reduction that has been done, they have been able to take the F-130 engines, put them in a pod that is essentially the B-52 compatible pod that goes on that pylon, and operate they have the 2-engine pod, so you have 2 engines in close proximity to one another and some unique vibrations. And so they've been able to do testing and really understand the performance of the engine in that environment and reduce a lot of risk on that. And as far as what we're looking for when we get to Milestone B, it is the readiness of the program to go into full-bore engineering, manufacturing, development. And I have a fairly high degree of confidence we'll be ready in the fall.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I just want to add, you would all been proud. We had our Defenders of Liberty air show at Barksdale a couple weeks ago. We had 160,000 civilians on base to check that out. It was awesome. I yield back.
Your time has expired, Mr. Johnson. And if we're going to do infomercials, you know, I can talk about Columbus Air Force Base or the great 172nd or the 185th in Mississippi. I now recognize Mr. Bergman for a question. General Bergman.
Yeah, no. Mr. Bergman on Hask. To be taken for the record, because when Congresswoman Kagan's talked about, you know, pilot training and time, for the record, and by the way, I think it's important that we ask the Department of the Navy as well, because they control the Marine Corps and the Naval Aviation Training Pipeline. I'd like to just see a timeline from the point where that second lieutenant is commissioned to the point where they report for flight training, to the point where they're going to get their wings, go through transition training to their type model series that they're going to be operationally capable, and to the point where they're a full up round in the squadron deployable, and the end date is the first date then that their initial contract is up. Okay? So the day they're commissioned till the date that they can leave active duty and move on. That would be very helpful for us in a lot of different things. So just take it for the record, and if you can get it to us. We're going to ask the same thing to the other, to the Department of the Navy as well. Thank you.
Happy to do it, sir.
Did anyone else have a question? If not, this hearing is adjourned.